Welcome to the Miller Report. I'm Maggie Miller. Today we're digging into a report from RealClearInvestigations' James Varney titled "The Greenhouse Gas Windfalls Blew Hard for Solar in the Biden EPA." The Trump administration is zeroing in on another massive green spending package, the $7 billion Solar for All program, part of the $27 billion Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund from the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act. It aims to bring solar energy to over 900,000 low-income households. But the Trump administration froze the funds via executive order, halting compliance with the act to reassess its impact on fossil fuel development. States and nonprofits are now suing over this pause. Supporters call the program vital to fight climate change, while critics argue it's a green boondoggle benefiting well-connected progressive groups. Real Clear Investigations reveals that a large chunk of the frozen funds was earmarked for publicly funded environmental groups and agencies, mostly in Democratic states. The largest nonprofit award, $311.4 million to Grid Alternatives, which was co-founded by Tim Sears, an Obama-era White House champion of change for solar deployment. The investigation also found the 2024 Solar for All grants totaled more than double what the EPA spent on hazardous substance superfunds, and $3 billion more than its environmental program budget. Yet only 12 of the EPA's 15,000 employees were assigned to manage it. Real Clear Investigations' James Varney joins us now to discuss where the Solar for All money is now and what sort of roadblocks it has hit. James, thanks for being here.
Happy to do it, Maggie.
So would you walk us through where that money is?
Well, the Solar for All is $7 million of what the Biden administration called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which in total was $27 billion. And you've probably seen a lot of stories in the news about the $20 billion that they parked at Citibank. So that special kind of carve out took that money outside of Treasury's control. The $7 billion that comprises Solar for All stayed under the Treasury Department's control. So the Trump administration froze the money before it could be distributed. It was supposed to go out in about 60 different grants to various state agencies, nonprofits, tribal agencies, and the like. So far, I think just under 31 million was distributed before the freeze was put on. So that money remains right now at the Treasury Department.
And what was your biggest takeaway from the program's record, and who has been receiving those funds?
Well, on the second part about who's receiving it, I think it was interesting to see that there is this tight network, really a nationwide one, of the nonprofits and the state agencies that were working to advance or are working to advance the green agenda. And we saw some of the same names with the $20 billion Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and this. So, for example, you had a group called Inclusive Prosperity Capital. That's part of the Solar for All. It was supposed to get $100 million or so. And it is also partnered with Inclusive, no E at the end, in New York City, which got almost $2 billion out of the other part of the greenhouse gas reduction funds. You also would see things like nonprofits that had partnered with other government agencies that were going to get grants. You had the biggest single nonprofit getting money in Solar for All was called Grid Alternatives. It's based in Oakland. It was supposed to get $311 million. And it has historically partnered a lot with a energy department, which is in the mayor's office, I guess, at Washington, D.C. It's a Washington, D.C. entity. And that entity was itself supposed to get about $61.2 million. So you see how these things are all kind of tied together. The pots are kind of slopping around here and there, and it just creates a huge amount of money for this network.
So it seems like a very tight-knit network there, and you've reported the EPA's budget grew 400% under the Biden administration. The Trump administration has gotten right in there, and they're trying to unencumber themselves of these Biden-era decisions as they now work to get that money back. Are you surprised with how quickly they've been able to do this?
I am surprised at how quickly the administration is moving, especially when you compare it to the first Trump administration. And of course, he had his hands tied by a lot of things like the Russia hoax and all that aren't around now. But he seems to have learned from that experience, and they're moving at lightning speed on a lot of different things. I'm not surprised that they're moving quickly on the energy component of it all, because one, that was a big part of his campaign, that he was going to try and reverse this huge money that Biden was trying to shift over to green or renewable or clean energy as part of their net zero framework. So that didn't surprise me much. Now, we do need to remember that he has tried to freeze all this. We don't know how successful it's going to wind up being. The $20 billion that's at Citicorp, that's tied up in a lot of lawsuits. The $7 billion in the Solar for All that you and I are talking about here, some of that might get tied up in lawsuits. But I'm not surprised that he was able to take these kind of big pots and at least freeze them. Now, whether or not that will end it and we save that money, I think that remains to be seen.
You've touched on it briefly, but I'd like to get into it a little bit more. Why does it seem like there's a disparity with where the money is going? And your reporting, you say that it's going to primarily Democratic states and groups. Why is this the case? Is this because that they seem to be more involved in it?
Well, I think that's a good point, what you just made. Like, you probably do see a lot more activity on the green energy fronts in the blue states, so to speak, than you do in the red states. But I don't think that's all that surprising. That's probably as old as the hills a little bit, right? That whoever is in power tries to kind of get the gravy going to its bases and things like that. And obviously, the Congress people are all sort of squabbling and fighting to get their pork for their district. So you did have a very liberal administration involved in crafting all this. So it doesn't really surprise me that much that it looks like the lion's share of the money did go to blue states, did go to state agencies that have been aligned with the net zero, the renewable energy kind of frontier that we see here. So, but you also had something, the EPA was telling me about this, that they feel that this solar for all might have a little bit more support than some of the others because it is more nationwide, because you had 60 recipients, and therefore it might have a little more bipartisan support in Congress. I don't know if that's going to be true, right? Congress seems like it's not doing anything since it passed the continuing resolution. But it could be that this is something that some people like. The EPA told me last year, the Biden EPA told me last year when we first wrote about this in October, that they knew some Republican Congress members that were quite happy that their district was going to get some money here. So that could all wind up being a factor in terms of how quickly the Trump administration is able to get this back.
In your reporting, you quoted Amy Cook, who called this a quote, redistribution of wealth from taxpayers to the well connected, end quote. So, is there enough legs behind this program to do what it's meant to do, which is bringing that energy to 900,000 low income households? Or is it unfortunately just lining people's pockets?
That's a really good question. And I should say that we didn't come out and say that it was lining people's pockets. This was something that some of the critics that we quoted saying when we were reporting the story. There's a feeling, and you and I talked about it a little bit a moment ago, that it's going to very specific groups in very specific areas. And so I think as a consequence of that, you've got a little more, what's the word we might look at, skepticism, or they might be a little more dubious about whether or not it's going to be able to achieve its goals. I think its goals are probably not achievable, right? They're supposed to get $7 of private money for every single dollar of federal money. I don't see how they're going to be able to attract that kind of private investment. If it was such a good deal, private investment would probably already be there. They're supposed to get somewhere, I think, in the neighborhood of 800 or 900,000 homes. And remember that 70% of this or more, the money is supposed to be spent on what they call low income or disadvantaged communities. We don't know that there's really any organic market or demand for that there. So I don't know that it will be able to hit the goals that the program set for itself. I think most people are skeptical of that.
What do you take away from the discovery that more money was put into this program than other budgets within the EPA that people may argue are more important?
Right, it did. It wound up really being the single biggest part of the EPA. The amounts of money in this are really staggering. They're unprecedented. The EPA has been what, a $15 billion agency, and here we are talking about $27 billion. No one had ever seen the like. And I think that one of the things people are all freaking out about everything that's going on, right? Not just in energy. You see it in the education department. The entire Department of Government Efficiency project is under attack, right? But if you look at what the Biden administration was doing, it was really aspirational. We talked about this just a moment ago about whether or not it was going to be able to achieve its goals. The idea that you're going to be able to wrench the US economy or the world economy, which runs largely on fossil fuels at the moment, you're going to be able to turn that into a net zero 2030 or net zero 2050, or you're going to get 50% of the cars in the US are EVs in just a few years. None of that's really feasible. It was all, like I said, it was all aspirational. So I think that people are, one, skeptical or dubious that any of this could be achieved. Two, it's money that neither the EPA or some of these other agencies had ever seen before. Now, the figures get kind of screwed around, right? Like if you look at USA spending, you'll see some bigger numbers. That's what's been obligated. It doesn't necessarily mean that all of that's been spent. You know, they have $9.7 trillion obligated in fiscal year 24. Spending was, I think, around 6.5 trillion. But that just sort of reflects how huge this gamble was, this bet that was being made. And I think that when people look at that in its whole perspective, they probably will be a little less freaked out about what it is that Trump is trying to do.
And how about that funding in regards to hazardous substance super funds and environmental program budgets? How does that work out?
Well, I think most people associate those things with the EPA's core mission. And this was a bigger amount of money than the EPA had dedicated to things like Superfund, things like environmental projects and cleanup. Okay. You also, the fact that I said that 70% of it or more was supposed to go to low income or disadvantaged communities, that kind of reflects the Biden administration's environmental justice framework that they put on this, that I think also might kind of, one, warp how you're spending the money, and two, make it less likely that you're going to achieve your goal for the country. So that just sort of shows you that the amounts of money and what they were doing, it wasn't going to the EPA's core mission as far as people have understood it over the years.
Obviously, energy policy can be a little convoluted for some people. So, what would you say to them to wrap things up?
I think the most important thing, and we hit at this a little bit a moment ago, is that uh, everybody's, not everybody, but a lot of people are reporting everything as if the sky is falling, right? As if American education is going to come unraveled because the DOE is getting downsized or eliminated, that energy is going to become just, the US is going to be covered with smokestacks again, okay? And we're all going to suffer some terrible death from global warming in a half a century or quarter century or whatever. I don't think any of that's true. And I think that what we're seeing is a swing back to a little more of a traditional energy approach for what we're talking about here, that people are missing that. They're thinking that this is something that's radical, when in fact, what we're reporting, what we're talking about was radical. And I think as that gets kind of stopped or at least downsized quite a bit, things will return more or less to the kind of environment that most Americans have expected and liked in terms of their energy over decades now. I don't think, we talked about this a little bit when you and I were talking a couple of weeks ago, that I don't think you're going to see $1.50 gas at the pump. But I do think that all of this stuff is ultimately going to lead to a much healthier and better, more energy and more affordable energy for Americans.
Well, James, I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me here today.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.
That was it for the Miller Report. We'll see you next time.